Thank you all for taking the time to hear us chat. This is hopefully a very exciting panel because we have a lot of different people operating at high levels in different parts of the art market. So we have Brooke Lampley of Sotheby's, the global chair
of global fine art.
Of global fine art.
It's double the global.
Okay,
yeah,
double global. We have Gardy St, Fleur, who is an art advisor and collector.
Yep.
We have Tom Hill, who's the chairman of Two Sigma, but also has the Hill Art Foundation, and also sits on the advisory board of Christie's, and also sits on the board of Gagosian. So multiple perspectives. And then we have Allan, who has, hopefully, everyone knows and who needs no introduction. But do you want an introduction? We have Allan Schwartzman, who is sponsoring this event. And so I think I would love to start because we have an ample amount of time, I'd love to begin this by asking some pretty broad questions and then drilling down into specifics. So I think maybe starting with Brooke, are we in a buyer's market, and what does that actually mean?
Sure, I think we are. I think there's been a lot of economic pressure in a variety of ways. Maybe Tom can speak to those forces. And in addition to that, people need to choose, in our market, in the auction market, in secondary sales, people need to choose to sell. So when there is any question of economic contraction, and that can be for any multitude of reasons, it doesn't have to be about your back door. It can be about what's happening halfway across the world and how that impacts the diversity of buyers for the market. It impacts whether people are proactively choosing to sell in that moment. So we've seen recently a significant contraction in supply. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You contract the supply, and it would seem that the market is down in some ways. I think we'll see, looking ahead to, we have spring auctions coming up. I think we'll see very good results. Because I think we have a healthy buying audience in proportion to the amount of supply that will be available.
Just to quickly follow up on something you said, you're seeing a contraction of supply. Is that at every tier of the market, or where are you seeing more availability and where are you seeing a real pullback?
Well, it's at every price point, but I would say particularly with emphasis on the $1 million and above lots, and that can be cutting edge artists whose works are escalating in price and who in a strong market could have a really big breakout price. People might want to test the market a little bit less right now, but that could equally be, for a $20 million masterpiece.
So I'm actually going to jump to over here because the question then that follows is looking at that kind of secondary environment that we're in, is there a halo effect on galleries? Is there a halo effect on a primary market? How does that impact?
The primary market is kind of mysterious to most people, at least how the market is reported. Because the only numbers that are published are auction numbers, and that's, roughly 10% of the market? So there's usually some broad generalizations assumed that are often not accurate. The primary market is, it depends. There are certain artists that work sell out before the shows open. Artists who got hot in the last few years, it's cooled quite a bit, mostly, but not fully. But it doesn't mean that shows aren't selling out. They're just selling slower, in my experience. The real sticking point, which is really the most disturbing part to me, is that somehow in the process of this market growing and developing further and further, it's somehow switched from a world of people buying artworks rather than works made by artists. And so the relationship to the living artist changed dramatically. And because the market, as it got higher, as prices went up, as more buyers came in, the market also got safer. And what that meant at a certain point, particularly the last few years, is that artists who had lived very healthy lives, having a show every few years, selling out always, and having a devoted buyership, for so many of those artists, the market's just completely stopped. If they're artists that do not have, there are many artists who don't perform well at auction, but have very healthy primary markets, and those are more micro markets and very specific. But the artists who were kind of the meat and potatoes, I hate to use that phrase, it sounds derogatory, but
Some people like meat.
the artists who were the who have been the core of the market and the core of the art community, I should say, the core of the contemporary market, for so many of them, the market has just come to a stall.
That's very interesting. And so, Tom, then, you are a very major collector. A lot of people come to you with things. Are you seeing more opportunities? Are you seeing more things that more things that are made available that you would like? Or is this not really shaking out in a way that you find interesting or advantageous?
Well, I think you have to look at the factors influencing the market. And first, what market are we talking about?
Right.
Because, we collect in 4 areas: old master paintings, Renaissance and Baroque bronzes, modern masters, and then avant-garde art. I mean, not only living artists, but artists in their 30s and 40s who are really, I would say, doing very interesting things around the world. And a lot of what has gone on the last 3 years is a function of the macro environment. And you mentioned, Brooke, what causes somebody to sell? Well, when interest rates go from 0 to a really high level, I thought money was free. So I got to pay interest on this. And also, I thought the work of art was going to go up. Well, that combination of not going up or maybe even going down, and then interest burden. So I think you've got to look at some of the factors that drive every other market. And take stocks. You've got fundamental factors and you've got technical factors. Well, what are fundamental factors? Well, take an artist like Picasso or an artist like Warhol. They have the 2 largest market capitalizations in the world. They've got more out there, and the price per painting or per sculpture is creating an enormous market capitalization, which means there are always transactions. And there's enormous supply, but there's also enormous demand. And so that's, essentially both a fundamental and a technical factor. But momentum, sentiment, markets turn on a dime around sentiment. And, an artist that was doing really well at auction all of a sudden is looking at, a bunch of buy-ins at auction. And that has a really debilitating effect.
Well, so I want to go back to my initial question, but I'm also curious, in your experience, is the money still there, right? Or has the money left the market? Is the money sitting on the sidelines waiting to re-enter the market?
I think we're talking about, again, segmenting the market.
Let's talk 20th, 21st century.
And let's talk about what price point, because you've got to segment the market. Works of art that are under $1 million, and then when you segment that, works that are under 100,000, and then works that are between 5 and 10, and then over 20. You've got to completely segment the market. And there's no shortage of billionaires being created. We were talking before about what's Jeff Bezos collecting. Well, I have no idea, but he can collect wherever he wants. And if you look at the wealth creation in the tech area, and we're just seeing now an enormous momentum around wealth in technology, and you're going to see a lot more of that play out. So if they have their fifth house, they have their boat, they have their plane, they want to have something on their walls at some point. So there is demand, but you got to look at each segment of the market.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because if you actually look at reported auction sales year over year, they have not really ever topped 2014. And if you adjust for inflation, they're significantly down from 2014. Now, the primary market, and you're looking at me like that's wrong.
No, you 2014 or 2024?
No, 2014. 2014 was sort of the high of auction sales, unless I'm wrong. In
Okay,
case.
I'm there with you.
Okay. But, I mean, I'm happy to be told that I'm
No,
wrong.
I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, you're seeing an auction market whose art sales have contracted, even if their luxury sales have grown stronger. Happy to have you tell me that I'm wrong here too, but
Well, I mean, we've actually, given the economic environment, you could argue that the resilience of the art market has been impressive, and it's contracted a lot less than than economic forces would suggest. And we've been relatively consistent, at least Sotheby's, over the last couple of years. And we've sold over $1 billion privately in addition to the auction market for the last 5 years running. So
no question.
I don't mean to be, but it's not, the point isn't to be defensive.
Not at all, and actually this is great. But the point is that at best, over the last decade or so, in nominal terms rather than real terms, the auction market has plateaued, right? And we're talking about more billionaires being created. We're talking about more people entering into the market, and we're talking about, at least in secondary sales that are publicly registered, you're looking at not a major increase. And so I think maybe, Gardy, you can speak, hopefully, to this idea of growing audiences from the ground up. And I'm curious what your clients are interested in, how your clients began to be involved in collecting, and how sustainable that feels.
So I'm following up with Tom. What Tom was saying, there's a lot of new money. My clients are people that have disposable income. They have guaranteed funds. So I'm buying right now. I'm looking for great pieces to buy, and my clients wants to buy more art. And so the price point around 50 to $500,000. My clients all day like, hey, I need more work.
Interesting.
So there's a huge growth there.
But could I just say that it's not just more is more. More new people coming into the market often replace other populations stepping back. And so, you were mentioning, it's also partly, what is your intention? How do you buy art? How do you use your art? It's relatively new that people have really exploited art as a financial asset. So for those people who were really happy to be collecting art, getting a loan against it, and buying more art, interest rates have put a lot of pressure on that type of collecting. Now, there are a lot of other people who were just collecting art and putting it on their wall, and it hasn't changed their collecting profile. Or equally, like, you could talk about the Russian market being super hot at one point in time, and trade that in favor of the Chinese market being very strong for a period of time. You know what market has been strong for that entire duration of time? Generally speaking, the American art buying market, and growing. So I just think, I think all of this is true, but it's not just accretive all the time.
Right. That's fair. Well, please.
No, I was just going to make one point, which is that the market, particularly, let's say, in post-war and contemporary art, especially, and now, since post-war is a funny term, since it's so long ago, let's say more contemporary art, there were always moments in good economic times and bad where the market reaches saturation and changes its mind. You know, there are artists whose prices rise and then they flatten out. And sometimes it's work that's out of step, and then maybe it comes back at another moment. But there are also moments where the market decides this is a number, and they're kind of they're not arbitrary numbers, but they're there. That where above a certain number, it requires a different level of thought. And so the market's always sorting through what it finds valuable and what it doesn't in any kind of market. We have a tendency to want to tie decline in certain markets to timing. I mean, if I look at the 1980s, for example, all of the art that was very hot, that drove the market in the early 80s, when it was a boom time, it was the beginning of the Reagan years, was looking awfully frothy and bombastic. By the time you got to the end of the decade, when the AIDS crisis was killing off entire creative communities. And so that was a time where artists like Bob Gober and Charlie Ray and Chris Wall became more relevant to the times, and you could see that shift in the market. I don't know that you can always assign a value to a shift in the market unless they're really dramatic ones, tied to the broader economy. I would simply also add to that my experience, and it's now over a few years, is that real collectors, I should say, people who are dedicated to collecting, who have capital, will almost always buy when the thing comes forward that they really want. It may hurt at a certain time, but great collectors don't pass up on great things very often.
I think that's very apt, but also I think the question of what quality is, as you have just said, continues to shift.
More dramatically than we realize, I believe. I think
Can you expand?
I think, so I've been involved in the art world since the late 70s. Every decade that I've been involved, when a new sensibility emerged, or new sensibilities, it wasn't really that difficult to identify which artists were paving a path forward and that were likely to last. You may not understand whether this artist can go the same distance as that, but that would sort itself out. I think we're living in a completely different time now, where you have 6 or more primary strains in the contemporary art market or in contemporary art that are relevant and that are being pursued. And you don't just have 5 artists working in a strain, you've got 50 all of a sudden. So this, in the process of growing this business into an industry, we kind of overproduced an expectation of a need. And so I think, greatness and genius don't multiply at the same rate as wealth and populations. And so I think we're going through a very, very different time. It was discussed a bit this morning, but I think that the primary rules by which, or criteria by which we judged art I think there are new criteria that have not yet been clearly defined, and I think that's the nature of our time, and I think it's going to take quite a while.
I think we have an evolution, too, in the tastemakers. It used to be that museums were the arbiter. I mean, whether Alfred Barr, the modern, they would put an imprimatur on an artist and say, this artist is a game changer. You are safe collecting this artist. And I think everything has become much more, I would say, fragmented and much more decentralized. And you also have global considerations now that in the 60s and 70s, it was Europe and the US. Now you've got Asia Pacific, you've got what's going on. I mean, you had great artists in other parts of the world, but it wasn't part of the vocabulary and vernacular. So I think, that has changed too. And also, you've got now new forms of art, performance, media, NFTs. I mean, you've got, lots of new experimentation, some related to technology, some related to just how the work is made.
So the follow-up question, of course, is then how in your mind has the actual power within the art market shifted? You've also been operating at basically every level of the market from collecting and for quite some time. I mean, where do you think the balance of power sits at this point versus maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
Just like social media is driving a lot of influencers and impact, I think that fragmentation and that decentralization has resulted in many more voices and much more, I would say, discussion, confusion, and that tends to hit on short-term trends where somebody thinks, oh, I've got this trend and I'm going to jump on it. Well, a year or two down the road, they realized that it was just that, a trend that didn't last. I mean, it's a lot of what you were talking about, Allan.
Gardy, I see you nodding.
No, it's true. It's just so many artists now. There's so much inventory in the market, and it's trendy, and so to find great art is becoming more difficult. So
how do you sift through it? Like, what are the criteria that
research, a lot of research, a lot of data from the auction house, working with the auction house, working with dealers as well, to help me sort out all these work.
Yeah. I want to return for a moment to this idea that you brought up of fragmentation, because it in a certain respect is a primary market issue, but in another respect, it increasingly feels from the outside looking in like also a secondary issue as well. And I'm curious if you agree with that, Brooke.
Well, the part I really wanted to respond to, and I don't think this directly answers your question, but I completely agree about taste making. And you were asking me about power before, and I do think that in some respects it shifted power to the collectors, maybe to the disadvantaged artist. But what we see and what we express at auction houses is a total obsession with provenance, with named collections, and that's all about tastemaking. It's all about the imprimatur of an important collector now, as opposed to a museum or an institution, validating the quality and interests of an artist's work. And that's become a hugely important lens through which people understand, explore their taste, and seek out new avenues of exploration. And for us, it's become like the ultimate sales tactic, because our way of instructing people to look at new artists is through that lens of a collector. Like, don't take it from me. Trust Emily Fisher Landau. She collected this artist with these artists. And if you like this, this artist, then you may want to consider these other three. But I think that's all about the age of social media and kind of, the cult of personality.
Is there a downside to this? In other words, are there losers when you're trying to have collector-led taste? Are there losers at the very high level blue chip? I mean,
it's to the detriment of the quality of the object, because two equal objects, two equal artworks, and look, it's hard to establish equality. Part of the reason why we love art is because every single artwork is unique, but arguably two works of equal merit. One is owned by a collector or presented as part of a collection, and one that is not. The price or the value of the one from the collection will be greater. It will be. Right now, that is a fact in the market.
Allan, you work with living artists to quite an extent. When you're thinking about their markets and their position within the current market, does this factor in at all?
Well, I think you're referring to, I've expanded my advisory work in addition to collectors, to being artists and estates.
Yes.
And that's all about. It's not in competition with galleries at all. It's complementary work and it's legacy planning, and often that means, almost always it means, retelling a story from a fresh perspective, either because we have greater clarity about a particular artist, or a generation today isn't bound by the same limits or frameworks of an earlier generation's collectors. So the first, I guess we'll talk about this tomorrow for those who will be here, but the first artist that I started working with is the foundation of Robert Rauschenberg. And there was a general assumption about late Rauschenberg, which was reinforced by the market, that kind of was its own self-fulfilling prophecy, so that because the market thought that he wasn't really that inventive after the silkscreen paintings of the 60s, then you saw everything else kind of tank. And then because there were no records to support that something later might also be great and valuable, then it kept holding itself down. And it affected the markets for great works from the 50s and 60s as well, in part because he was an artist who didn't work in the stylistic consistency that markets are most comfortable with. So, he did a deep dive into all of those late bodies of work and realized, oh, this is a misassumption based upon recent exhibitions that had taken place through his primary market gallery. And they happened to be several exhibitions in a row of all over silkscreen paintings that did repeat that format. But, all of a sudden we discovered a completely different artist. So it's about retelling a story. And I'll simply say this, that the reason it was possible to begin, and we're just at the beginning of building value. I mean, their wealth comes from art, not from money. So the more valuable the art, the more money they have to give away, and they're giving away money in really innovative ways. So it's about the reason why we're able to see a lot of what he produced freshly is because more artists I know in their 30s, 40s, and early 50s cite Rauschenberg as the artist of his generation who speaks the most to them. And these are equally white artists and black artists. So it was kind of unprecedented. 25, 30 years ago, people would have said Warhol, and 20 years before that, they would have said Johns. So our perspectives change as contemporary art changes, and it causes us to reevaluate. I'm not saying it's going to be an easy road. I mean, you had a fantastic silkscreen painting in the Landau sale, which sold very modestly for what its quality was. So it takes a long time to build a market, but to rebuild a market. But it's always about. I mean, for me, it's always about the long run.
Just to press this point, though, you're talking about reframing a narrative or creating a new narrative, retelling a story. Within the cacophony of people who are also trying to tell their own story, the question is, how do you navigate that? I certainly know that many collectors with whom I speak are inundated by PDFs on basically a daily basis, right? There's many, many people vying for control of that narrative, and it seems like everyone is drowning everyone else out. I don't know if that's...
Well, it's probably true to a certain extent, but I've always believed that eventually there becomes pretty much an equivalence between artistic and historical value and financial value. It just takes sometimes a longer time for that to be sorted out. And so, especially at a moment where there has been an unprecedented number of very young artists emerging and a whole new market of buyers emerging, and then a whole older generation of collectors buying young artists in a way that that same generation had never bought them before. It kind of drove its own mania. For me, it's about, I only work with artists that I really believe in, and it's, we're not a gallery, so we're not really visible in what we do, but I I can name a few of the artists. They're all
By all means.
artists of great significance that have been underappreciated for various reasons. And so each time it requires a different approach and a different narrative. But I would, Rauschenberg, Reinhardt, Hannah Wilke. We're working with Cory Manzuto, with Jimmy Durham, which is really exciting me right now. We're working on legacy planning for Yoko Ono, which is a story that's just waiting to be retold. And is, for those who have seen the show at the Tate, it's started to be retold. So I just go with what I think is important, and I hopefully my criteria are take into account a bigger picture than, in contemporary art in particular. People are so focused on each artist that the overview is hard to maintain, and it's sometimes hard to see, and it's sort of what I think about most of the time.
Tom, you collect in depth, but then you're also moving towards a pretty broad spectrum of younger artists. How do you sift through it all? And how do you think about your own collecting?
Well, I think Michael Finley, in his book, The Value of Art, said it all, which is collectors collect for three major reasons. The first is bragging rights, wall candy, and how many apartments have you gone in New York City where you see one of each? One of each. There's your mandatory Warhol, your mandatory Johns. Just one of each. And that is a form of statement about, I want to play the field and I want to have one of each. The second is people, and under Michael Finley's definition, people who actually think they can outsmart the market. And I'm going to buy this artist because I think it's going to go up. Well, I think that's a fool's mission. You have no idea. When Warhols were selling at the low point in the 90s, you had no idea that a picture you could buy for $400,000 would be worth $12 million, $14 million. You had no idea. So anyway, that's a fool's mission. But the third is people who actually see something, they do the research, they love it, and then they want it. And if you love one, the odds are you want more than one. So I have my rule of 4, which is for modern masters, whether it's Bacon, Warhol, de Kooning, you go down the list, Lichtenstein, Rouchet, I want to have at least 4, de Kooning, I want to have at least 4 of their works. Because most of these artists lived multiple decades, like Rauschenberg. He had an unbelievable career and would constantly invent and then reinvent, and never stopped until they died. Same thing with Picasso. So that to me is a fun thing. Now, we apply the same rule with the younger artists we collect, which is rather than a rule of 4, we've got a rule of, Astrid, my daughter, knows, a rule of 8, a rule of 12, just because they're different price points. And but it's the same philosophy, which is if you love it, and you mentioned Allan, I think it's so true. Mark Grochon, who is somebody I've known and I collect, he calls me up, he says, Tom, you're on the board of the Met. I want to see that Matisse show, but I want to see it when there's nobody else there. And I said, well, I can arrange that. Do you want the curator too? And so it was a Monday. It was, we went through, and he spent 3 hours, essentially looking at the brushwork, and it was a form of retrospective. And I think you got to ask the artists, in their 30s and 40s, who, just like conversations I'd have with Warhol, which is, Andy, among the old masters, who influenced you the most? And he'd go into a long song and dance about Piero della Francesca. I said, okay, I get it. And so, I think the artists in many ways are the leading indicators because, who do they want to see? I mean, it's so interesting because we collect a lot of Christopher Wool. Christopher has done a show at, here. He took this space, in the Libeskind, studio where Libeskind was designing, after the Twin Towers came down, designing the redo of that space. And you see from this view, the 19th floor, you see Staten Island Ferry, you see Trinity Church, it's, 101, I think, Broadway by Vestry. And for 5 months, at his own expense, he's taken this space and he has his works. None of it is for sale, and it's in this space that is really Christopher. It's like graffiti from the old space. And, artists, and I was there for the opening with Astrid, and, who was there? Just artists. Just artists.
So just returning to the original question.
Allan was there.
And you.
Well, but so how do you sift through it? I mean, if you haven't met the artist, how do you discover things?
We have advisors like Allan.
Okay. There you go.
I mean, it helps to have, since the 90s, I've been involved in at least one museum at a time. I'm chairman of the Guggenheim now. I was chairman of the Hirshhorn. Jim Dimitrian was my patron saint because Jim had amazing taste. And so it's find people like Brooke. Brooke knows her art, and I buy a lot from Sotheby's, but find people you can talk to who you can actually say, I'm interested in this artist, and what do you think? And then study and look at art and read and look at more art.
And in your experience, has the role of the dealer stayed the same for the last couple of decades, or has it changed?
Well, in the 90s, when Larry Gagosian had only one venue on Madison, I would go on a Saturday, and Larry would have his list. So Cy Newhouse would be there first, and then Don Marin, and because I was young, and it was before Larry got to know me, and before I started buying a lot of art from him, and he squeezed me in, and I was like the new kid, but over time, every Saturday I would go, and over time we would sit there for an hour, hour and a half, and just talk. And he always had magic in his inner sanctum. This was not what he was showing; it was in his inner sanctum. But that was one venue. Gagosian now has 20 venues around the world, and you got to find other conversations, such as I had in the 90s, and you can have those kind of conversations with Brooke, with Allan. I mean, there are people out there who are really knowledgeable.
Gardy, where do you go for? Are you going to studios? Are you talking with dealers? How does it work for you?
Studio visit, dealers, auction house, artists, talk to artists as well, also help.
Who do you find that your clients connect with best?
As far as like artworks or just?
In terms of categories in the art market, are there certain ways in which maybe more nascent collectors are find more accessible?
My process is this: it's research, education, process, and acquisition, right? So my clients, I want them to have the interaction with the artists. That's important. It's best to know art from artists, right? So I try to set up studio visit just to have that interaction. And after that, we get comfortable. We start buying from auction houses and galleries and fairs. Yeah.
With clients who are relatively new to the market, given that we are suddenly in an environment where prices are not skyrocketing anymore, has that changed the way that they approach buying? Has that changed enthusiasm? Has that changed has that made them more wary of committing lots of money?
On my end, no. So my clients are actually, they actually want to get art, good quality stuff. So they're more, hey, I'm not trying to sell this. They really wants to build a legacy collection, or they're mostly buying stuff under trust for their family. So they're not people that needs to sell art. So they have the income. They really want good quality and good research, good works that's gonna talk to them and talk to their family as well. So they're actually looking for me to buy great works.
Can I say something?
Please.
Briefly? Every time there's been a challenge to the general economy, my business has increased. So what I deduce is that there are people who maybe times are more challenging. At certain times are more challenging, but then people who are not scared off want more validation and advice at those times, or they want to be more reflective. So we've often benefited from it. There's always speculators who enter the market not knowing what they're getting into. That can't last very long. Right. That can't last too many years, is what I mean, particularly now.
When you say that your business increases, do you mean that you have more clients, or you
More
mean that your
clients.
clients are spending more?
More clients, and at almost every point where there's been a real slowdown in the economy or uncertainty about it, that has become a moment where most of my clients get access to things that might not have been in the market otherwise. I would say that it has not, for the things they're pursuing, it hasn't really changed prices much. What it's changed is what you've had access to.
Have people been offering you things that you've wanted for a while that you haven't been able to get?
In the last year?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you talk about that without maybe naming names? But I mean, what has the process been like? I mean, again, you don't
Well,
need to go into too specific.
Again, I have the advantage I collect in 4 areas. So Renaissance and Baroque bronzes, there was an amazing exhibition. It was at Christie's. It was Claudia Quentin's exhibition. Her major bronze, Renaissance and Baroque bronze collection. And it was once in a lifetime. And you could find great objects at a reasonable price.
Were these objects that you had tried to get previously?
Yes. And one, I'd competed with her for it, and now I had a chance to buy it at a lower price than when I was competing for it. So, and I think you just have to be really patient, and you have to know what it is you want, but be opportunistic.
So, I mean, this is a question for everyone at this point. I mean, are the very high-end transactions, let's say over $5 million, still occurring but out of the public eye? Is the volume of those transactions down? I mean, for a lot of people who are maybe not dealing in this particular sphere, the question is whether or not things have sort of ground to a halt publicly and privately, or if there's still activity, but just people don't want to risk any sort of public exposure if things don't go well.
I don't think it's entirely about exposure. It's also about price protection. So yes, I find that when auctions or public sales are down, that private sales go up. That most famously happened during the pandemic, very significantly. And it was less about risking exposure and more about having greater price control. We've seen, sellers have been very reluctant to adjust their pricing expectations. And so that's part of why actually there's a contraction in supply as well, is a lack of agreement in some cases around price. And we've we have been using the guarantee instrument to continue to promote selling. Guarantees are when we commit a price up front and we participate in the upside beyond that price. It's a way to encourage people to sell in a market where they perceive risk. And so we've been able to keep up sales to a degree through that. But yes, there is definitely high-end transactional activity, well beyond $5 million, hundreds of millions of dollars for single works of art. But it's happening where people have greater, privately, where people have greater control over price.
So, I mean, I guess the question is, are these big-ticket mega evening sales a thing of the past? Or, sorry, you're going to...
No, I was going to say, if you just look at a new phenomenon and you saw it, I'd say 10 years ago in China, which is the advent of museums, okay, which is, at one point, China was creating hundreds and hundreds of museums every year. Well, guess what? They got to fill up the museums. And, unlike performing arts, where, you got constant cost of, costumes and, performers, and, you buy a work of art, that's, a fixed cost, and you can show it forever if it's a museum. So it's a different economic model, and particularly with all the buildings that were going up in Shanghai and Beijing, they wanted to actually make these ghost office buildings something more attractive. Well, put a museum in and kind of make it interesting. But that was China. Look at what's going on in the Middle East, where you have major, major countries. I mean, just look at the price of oil today, 86 for Brent. Okay, so what do you got? You've got massive cash flow. And this has been going on. So look at the Al Thani family in Qatar. Look at what Saudi Arabia is doing. Look at the Guggenheim. I mean, we're building a major museum. It's Frank Gehry again, just like Bilbao, in the Emirates, in Abu Dhabi. And, we've been buying art. And, many of these countries have funds, Brooke knows this, that are designed to buy masterpieces. Okay, so where did the card players, end up? In one of those collections, 250 million, private treaty.
It's, it really, I mean, one can infer from what you just said that the way to look at where collecting is going is to look at where basically sovereign wealth has.
No, I'm talking, that's, again, you got to look at every aspect of the market. That is at the absolutely high end. And, there are any number of collections within those countries that are not spending 250 million, that are spending, $1 million or 5 million or, whatever it takes to get what they want. And again, it's segmented where, a lot of minimalist work is ending up in, Qatar. A lot of sculpture is ending up in Qatar in different pockets.
Yes. So I'm conscious of time and that people probably have questions, even though I think we could all keep talking for a while. But before we turn it over to Q&As, I have a question that I would like each one of you to answer, which is simply the question that what are you thinking about now that you think that the rest of the art market or art world, if you want to be more inclusive, will be thinking about in a year's time? And since, Brooke, we began with you, I will ask you this question.
Yeah, there are a lot of options to choose from, but we focus a lot on the potentially shrinking buyer audience. I don't actually believe the buyer audience is shrinking. I think the definitive trend is greater wealth creation, which will encourage more art buying. I think there will be more individuals interested in buying art. And I think, there will be more people, wealthy people, but also there's a greater awareness of, and hopefully we're all encouraging this, of art being accessible, that art buying is something that a lot of people can do. And along with that, I think that there will be continued exploration of ways to acquire art in decentralized or non-individualistic ways. So whether that's fractionalized ownership of art or more of another DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization that I unfortunately defeated for the Constitution.
You look crushed.
It wasn't intentional. But I think that more varied ways of acquiring art in partnership that create greater access for more people, I think will be something that we'll continue to explore and see people exploring.
Gardy?
Growing the sports market, as athletes are getting more money. So I think there's a huge opportunity globally to expand the market there. So I'm going to continue pushing forwards with that agenda.
Interesting. Tom, what about yourself?
Well, it's such a broad question. So a year from now, I think you're going to be amazed at how art and what is going on in real estate around the world gets transformed. I talked about China and these big office buildings, and let's put a museum there or create a separate space to make it more compatible to people. And you walk into this building, and Jerry Speyer, this is, a Tishman Speyer building, okay? You see lots of art. I mean, just look what we got here. I mean, you walk in and, you look at, there is this amazing Christopher Wool and Charlie Ray just up the street here, a mosaic. And so I think what you're going to see, particularly in major cities where you've got buildings that have problems. I mean, Christopher Wool, what did he do? He took over a whole floor for 5 months at very cheap rent. This was the way it was in the 60s and 70s, where an artist could find space and show his or her work, and people would come, and it was really cool. So I think what we're going to have, and it's a way to popularize art too. These are all will be free. I mean, all these buildings, you can walk in the lobby and see art, and I think that is going to accelerate with what's going on in the real estate. We talked before, James, about what's going on in real estate around the United States and the world.
Just to quickly follow up on this, though, I mean, commercial real estate is in quite a bit of trouble. Are you saying that, so there aren't necessarily new buildings popping up everywhere?
No, but you have to reinvent a lot of those buildings.
Gotcha.
And art is a great way to humanize, to bring people in, and to make them feel that, so people want to come.
That's really interesting. Allan?
I'm not sure I really have a clear answer to that. I would just, for a moment, like to build on what Tom said, is that you can link to some extent, the growth of the significance of large-scale sculpture in the late 60s and early 70s to the availability of cheap real estate. Alana Heiss, who started PS1, created a lot of short-term alternative spaces from empty storefronts in Tribeca. And that's why Richard Serra had opportunities to spray lead on a wall. And the cost of living here has gotten to such a point that you're seeing a lot more focus on painting. So I'm very curious to see, because this makes total sense to me, if we see a shift in opportunity that then impacts the very nature of what art is being made. But in terms of what do I think people will be talking about or thinking about a year from now, I see two thoughts that go into totally different directions. One is about legacy. Is like, okay, I bought a few thousand works of art. Where am I going with this? What am I going to do with my art? And it's impacting the buying that people are doing, but it's also causing many more people to think about community and public. I think a lot of the disruption, and it's not a fair word, disruption, a lot of the turmoil that we've been experiencing in recent years has created much more of a consciousness about community and what that means, and usually in a much broader way than we would have said before. And look, there's some people who do that and some who just want to keep counting their dimes. And in the realm of new collectors, I think that there will inevitably be in the near future, whether it's a year from now or two, I don't know, but there will be a natural reckoning of what they're buying and why. I think the vast majority of people who have entered the market collecting younger artists have done so under the assumption that it's a really smart place to put their money. And so as we see shifts in taste and behaviors in the market, and artists who don't fulfill a promise that seemed to be there, maybe in fact because they got too much attention early on, I think we're going to see a lot more concern about where does this go, not just what is the fun of today.
Well, that seems like the opening to another hour-long discussion. So before we go down that particular avenue, I think we should probably open it up to questions.
Does anybody have a question?
If not, we can absolutely continue with that. That's
My question alludes to one of the first panels, which was about how arts reporting is contracting, right? Especially at local markets. For local artists, there are fewer arts reporters. But I'm curious for this panel, what you think is either underreported or frequently misreported by art media because of the growing interest among the general public in the art market, right? Like the live streams for art auctions now have exploded worldwide, and there is increasing interest from the general public about art foundations and even about who is on the board of major art museums. But I would be really curious for all of you, because you see this, you can see what is being misreported or misconceptions, what you feel like the art press could do better in covering a topic that is of growing interest to a wide number of people who will never buy art in their lives.
Does anyone want to take this?
I think the vast majority of general publications have shrunk tremendously the amount of space they give to art. And when they report on art, it's almost always about the market. It's not about the art. So I think there's a direct correlation there between market activity, which means auction activity, since that's what they can report or what they have access to. And I think that's, to some extent, a function of media itself, the media, being challenged with its own survival. And so you have newspapers and magazines having expectations of a more direct link between what's covered and who's paying for ads than it ever had before. So I don't think it's a good-looking picture here. I think that well, I won't go on forever. I'll let everybody else.
Yeah, I'd make a distinction between art that is in public places where it's accessible, and then art that is used as a form of weapon to try to sell something else. And what you've got, I think, a very insidious trend. And you walk into any major retailer now, and invariably you will see some art. And I don't want to get into the names, but what is that art doing there? Well, it's to promote fashion. and it's to sell merchandise. And, I know why the artists do it. I know why they like to see their works on the wall, but there's a difference, between, and, Rashid Johnson is a really good friend of mine. There's a difference between a Rashid work at LaGuardia, where, when you go into it, you see this amazing work of art, versus when you go into Tiffany's and see one of Rashid's works there. There's a difference. And I love Rashid, and, he is a good friend, and, I support he and his wife. But I think there's something going on with the commercialization of art, and I haven't quite figured it out. Maybe, Allan, you can help me figure it out.
I've been thinking about it.
Where, again, it's really good for the artist, but, and it gets their work shown. But again, I think it's a double-edged sword. So,
I agree with Allan. The media just, blame Christie's and Sotheby's, but it's all about the numbers. But yeah, we can do better with that. Yeah.
Oh, I utterly agree with you. Said it at the very beginning. The performance of the art market is generally reported based on the performance of auctions, and that's not a comprehensive, representation by any means, nor is it often accurate, because there are very few performance metrics for the auctions. And there was a, I thought, very insightful, accurate article recently focused on the withdrawals that we do to raise the sell-through rate, because the art market hinges on the sell-through rate of the major auctions. So we would be fools not to try to engineer the best sell-through rates possible, but that doesn't tell a very full story of what's happening in the art market, nor is it accurate, since increasingly we withdraw works that we know have no interest.
Are there any other questions, or can we keep talking about? Or
Any other questions? There's one in the back there, Tommy.
I was thinking of the point that Brooke made about the significance of a collector's name tied to an artwork and the provenance on the secondary market. I was wondering what you all think might be a corollary for this on the primary market.
The primary market is completely, if it's done decently, responsibly, is all dependent upon who's given access when and how that's leveraged. I mean, establishing an artist, a dealer wants to place work selectively, even at a point where it may not be so easy to sell it. It's more about getting the work into collections where it won't reemerge too quickly back into the marketplace, where it's being sold to collectors who are known for leading the way in terms of new art, and where where the art will be seen by meaningful enough people. So that's always a very thoughtful process is required for that.
But Allan,
Yeah.
could I ask you, doesn't the dealer to some degree function as the tastemaker?
Most dealers I know, they find artists through their artists. They listen to artists. And they absolutely have their own taste and they go with it. But they are most enthusiastic or feel most empowered by artists that their artists believe in, which also reinforces the kind of spirit of that particular gallery, especially in a time period when the individual identities of galleries have become a lot more blurred. I think in the 50s and 60s, no young art was being bought in the 70s. The dealer definitely drove taste, but it was simply that was one collector who was willing to open a gallery.
do either of you want to add something? Should we add?
Oh, yeah. 1 second.
Hi. So I have a question about the role of the private foundations in the market. Tom, you have a private foundation. Allan, you've established quite a few private foundations. A lot of times, you know, foundations in the market have played a huge role, right, with the galleries increasingly wanting to place works by their artist, the hottest artists, into these foundations. But let's say this season, we're going to see a major private foundation actually sell its holdings at auction, the Rosa de la Cruz. And Allan, you mentioned that you're seeing some kind of a more communal future for these kinds of foundations, and yet here it is, it's going to Christie's. And what impact will it have on the artist markets? You know, a lot of times, you know, private foundations get great deals on acquisitions. You're prioritized, obviously, and yet, you know, they go to auction, not to a museum, to ICA nearby. So I just kind of want to raise this issue. You know, I don't know, Tom, if you've made any provisions for your collection down the line. I mean, are you planning to donate it? Will it all go to auction? I mean, it just like it's a little bit alarming because I think the market and the community treats these institutions as treats these collections as institutions, but.
Yeah, I think a lot depends upon what is the purpose of the foundation, and when the foundation buys a work of art, what is the agreement, not only with the artist, assuming the artist is alive, but also what the deal is around where that work of art is going to end up. And frequently what happens is, you know, it'll be in a foundation, but then it'll end up in a museum. And I don't know what the stipulation is in the De La Cruz. And, you know, I don't know why, you know, they, you know, are selling, I guess because they're dead is the reason, but.
Not they're dead, just Rosa is dead. I mean,
Okay, I thought both had died. No? Just one, okay. So got that wrong. But I can't speak to them as to what the motivation is, but I know if you're careful, you want to make sure that the artist, as in our art foundation, we want to make sure that the artist is protected, and you don't want to have loose ends.
I would add, nobody looked to Miami as a model city for patronage in the arts. It's a city whose museum nearly closed. It ultimately resulted in a split of a board, which then resulted in a museum which died almost as soon as it opened and then sold its name and its identity to another person. Everybody has enjoyed the deep commitment to contemporary art of a number of collectors in Miami, but none of these foundations ever were masquerading as permanent. It's especially shocking within, let's say, a month or less than a month of Rosa's death that her collection is going up for sale. My understanding is that the family has been selling works quietly in recent years while she's still alive, so she's participated in that decision making. And to answer the other part of your question, there are a few artists that early on Rosa collected in huge depth, and she was as much a patron of those artists as anything. And the two that come to mind most for me are Felix Gonzalez-Torres and Jim Hodges. Felix's market has been a very controlled resale market. It's been a very limited resale market. So how many pieces come forward with what rate is going to be important. Jim Hodges is a wonderful artist with a very healthy ongoing primary market and a somewhat thin market at auctions. So I personally worry for him. I do think that when something switches from love to commodity, things can change. So I just hope that, who got that? Was it Christie's?
Christie's.
One hopes that they go about it thoughtfully and responsibly.
Yeah, I'm not on the hot seat right now. It's great.
Yeah.
I'll be buying.
Well, we can take one more question.
I read somewhere that roses was never a foundation. So that's important to know, that she didn't form it as a foundation. She just had it in an art space to keep collecting. But, so I don't know what that means, but, okay.
I don't.
But I think the point stands about confidence in private, public art institutions, because I think that's something we will see increasingly in the future and have already seen a huge trend towards. We will see people with significant wealth amass great art collections and look for the appropriate way to share that with the world. Increasingly, our institutions are being forged by individuals and not by committees or governments in the same way. So I think it is an issue for the market going forward.
That being said,
Community.
dealers have to sell art, and it's a really nice thing to tell the artists whose art they're selling that it's going to somewhere special. But there's still the imperative that transactions need to occur. You look deeply, no?
No, I totally agree.
I mean-
Look, there have been, in the 80s, there were a few people who built private museums,
Right.
which looked like real museums on a small scale. None of these had a curatorial program. None of them had ambitious beyond having a museum in one's backyard and more walls on which to show a lot of great art. The world has gotten a lot more sophisticated since then. If Saatchi and Saatchi, if the Saatchis hadn't gotten divorced, and if Saatchi and Saatchi hadn't grown so rapidly, we would not have seen the sell-off, the wholesale sell-off of probably the greatest collection formed in its time. Nobody could have anticipated that, and I would argue for another day that that was the cause of the crash whenever that was sold, early 2000s, was it? It was there were nobody knew going, or 19 whatever. Nobody went into that sale understanding that there was that there were no reserves. And so the whole pattern of buying, the collector didn't, everyone who was waiting for the chandelier bidding, it didn't happen. And you could see the whole room just kind of retreat. It was kind of like, you know, the audience in the producers when they sing Springtime for Hitler in Germany. It was just, the room was like dead and stunned. But look, there's a lot more of a sophisticated approach. There are more people thinking thoughtfully and responsibly, regardless of whether they intend for them to go on forever or not. There's a couple of collectors I work with that have created, in one case a museum, in another case a foundation, that just get more and more serious about the long-term health of the collection and the broader areas in which they feel responsibility for giving. So I would hope that that as we see inevitably more people wanting to have their own spaces, be they short-term or long-term, that we're going to see a lot more thinking, and hopefully a lot more thinking that goes away from the one of each spirit and much more into individual identities, because at the end of the day, the trophy, if you go through MoMA, it's not just the trophies, but it's the unique Matisse that you didn't know to look at from 1913 that really defined a collection. The sanitized collection kind of didn't go.
Were you going to add something?
Yeah, I think, Allan didn't mention the names, so I'll mention, you look at what Mitch and Emily Rales have done in Glenstone, and it is unique. He has created depth. He's created a beautiful environment. You look at what Eli Broad has done. And so there are some really serious collectors who have created legacies and who have helped educate and helped guide, I would say, a whole generation of collectors.
Do we have time for another question, or are we?
Elizabeth, do you have a
Oh, hey.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating talk. The question I have is about pricing and inflationary impact. There's a lot of confusion in the gallery community right now about adjustment of prices and whether that has a positive short-term or long-term negative or positive effect on the artist market. And I'm just wondering if, those of you that are thinking through this regularly, is it something that you feel is valid given the kind of economic backdrop that we've been adjusting to? Is it something that you feel confident buying at different price points that are different than the benchmarks that we have set in this kind of bubble period during the pandemic? And what generally is your attitude toward those shifts, particularly among emerging and mid-career artists?
Well, I think there's certain, I would say, paradigms around the primary market, which is you constantly want the primary market to continue to go up. And you never want to have an instance where the primary market, is, going down. And a number of artists, get trapped into the secondary market, getting way ahead of itself. And then the dealer says, oh, I'm going to piggyback on top of what was in the secondary market. And then you have a problem in the primary market. So, if the dealer knows what he or she is doing and they're responsible, they will never let that happen. So I always like to say the secondary market, can go up and can go down, but you really got to control the primary market.
That is so true.
Let's stay on this though for a second, because this is it's a very important question, which is just how the prices now, not in abstract terms, but the prices now and the ways in which they have been adjusted or that people want to adjust them. What is that?
The secondary market for contemporary art grew because people couldn't get access to art. And so that resulted in prices that were 10, 20 times what the primary market prices were. There's a lot in the contemporary market of some of the most reputable dealers where they've raised the primary market prices to the secondary, which sends out a message that there isn't a lot of confidence in the long-term health or well-being of these artists. I actually believe that a lot of artists would benefit, and I think this requires some kind of thinking across the marketplace, especially mid-career artists for whom the market has really virtually stopped. It's a lot of artists, and I don't see that changing in the near future. I think that it may for few artists, but it's not going to change across the board. And so I think I think it would be very healthy to see very significant drops for those artists who have experienced enough years without activity to really, there's a new collector base they need to find. And that's the person who's who's been priced out, where $200,000, $300,000 is a lot of money. It's not just a mid-career price.
To be clear, though, you're describing a catastrophic event for a lot of dealers and artists.
I would say that the majority of artists I'm thinking about show with galleries that are themselves threatened with catastrophic challenge. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that I think there can be nobility in that. And I think it's radical, but I think it's practical.
Nobility in dropping prices, not catastrophe.
In being willing to accept drops in prices, to come to a place where the market really is, and that will in turn naturally drive up demand. But yes, I think some of it you need to wipe the board clean a bit.
What kind of timeline are you thinking this is going to happen within?
Well, I mean, look at how much the primary market has become concentrated in, quote, mega galleries, each of which shows 100, 120 artists. This has been at the expense of most young galleries and some mid-career galleries. Younger galleries today, well, historically, most galleries have had, past the age of Paula Cooper, had a few artists who carried the cost of the gallery. And when one artist gets stolen by a bigger gallery or gets lured into a bigger gallery that's better financed, that's a blow. When the second one gets hit, it's often fatal. The rule of thumb used to be in starting a gallery that you need 2 years of capital to have no business in order, with nothing selling, in order to get through a rough time. As we heard Jasmine say this morning, she started on $2,000, which is fantastic. I'm thrilled that she did it, but it's not. It's nobody. Very few people of this tier of gallery, even those that are older but grew substantially, expected that much growth and then that much retraction. So I think there's a lot of talk about how this market needs alternatives to its narrowing way of operating. And I think someone who's willing to tackle this issue, I think there's really a lot to be done, because I think there's a lot of notable and significant artists who are suffering. And it's all about access and animation and reaching new collectors who, from a perspective that is not thinking speculatively, but is where it's just simply more affordable to more people.
Well, I think we're going to have to tie a bow on it right there, because which is an interesting place to stop. But we've blown past our window.
I think big round of applause for everybody. Thank you
James,
so much
well done.
to Tom and Brooke and Gardy and Allan. And